All right, we're starting off with this new topic today. We discuss experiments, and when while discussing experiments, we talk about how experiments are used in sociological research, if they're used in a sociological research. Of course, when you talk about experiments, experiments are used more in psychology, and nonetheless, because this is a part of our syllabus, we ought to know this, and we ought to know what experiments are and what the different types of experiments are. So experiments, there are two types of experiments in which people are asked to participate. We are talking about the difference between laboratory experiments and field experiments. What is the difference between a laboratory experiment and a field experiment? We refer to the term, we use the term laboratory experiment to refer to a situation that is artificial, right? We're talking about an artificial situation, or in other words, we're talking about a situation that is not what participants are like when they are, I mean, it's not a part of their everyday environment. For instance, if I want to conduct a research on AS sociology students, for me to be able to conduct a research on AS sociology students, it would make more sense for me to conduct this research at a school or at a college in a classroom where they are AS sociology students who are normally present, right? However, अगर इन्हीं बच्चों को मैं किसी XYZ लोकेशन पे बुला के किसी रेस्टोरेंट पे बुला के वहां पे उनसे उन्हें किसी एक्टिविटी के अंदर इन्वॉल्व करता हूँ, वहां पे उनसे अगर उनके बिहेवियर को ऑब्जर्व किया जाता है, राइट, या उनसे कोई क्वेश्चन फिल कराया जाता है, तो it wouldn't really be their normal environment, right? So experiments are of two types. Over here, we're talking about a laboratory experiment and a field experiment. Laboratory experiment, like I said, we use the term laboratory experiment, or we use the term laboratory experiment over here because laboratory experiments वो experiments हैं जो कि आप artificial environment में conduct करते हैं, ठीक है? वो experiments जो कि आप artificial environment में conduct करते हैं, we refer to them as laboratory experiments. Clear? However, field experiments are experiments that are conducted in the everyday surroundings of the participant. For students, it would be a classroom. For workers in a factory, it would be the factory itself. For uh, accountants, it would probably be their office, so on and so forth. So these are the two terms I wanted to make you all familiar with: the laboratory experiment, a field experiment. A laboratory experiment is when you usually conducted in closed rooms, cut off from the outside world. However, when you use the term field experiments has to do with they usually take place in everyday surroundings such as streets or workplaces. Let me write this down over here. Artificial environment. Right? Now, taking it a step ahead, laboratory experiment is a setting and a situation that is designed to test a hypothesis. For this, we need to know what the term hypothesis means. What is exactly a hypothesis? Hypothesis होता क्या है? जब हम hypothesis की बात करते हैं, तो hypothesis refers to anything that requires testing, right? For instance, if you do not know what two molecules of hydrogen and a molecule of oxygen would together make, right? You are testing a hypothesis. If you're not sure it would end up being H2O, you're testing a hypothesis, right? Hypothesis कोई भी या अगर आपको लगता है if you think Samsung works better than Apple products, that's a hypothesis that you're carrying. You haven't really tested it yet, or it further requires testing. Clear here? So, a laboratory experiment is a setting and a situation that is designed to test a hypothesis, an assumption or proposition about the relationship between two or more variables, right? When you talk about an experiment, we ought to know what variables are. Now, I'd initially explain you what these variables are. I'd give you an example, which we usually use while teaching psychology, but it's okay. It's all about explaining you what variables are and how do we put these variables to use, right? Let me give you all an example here. Let's just say we want to conduct an experiment. I'd like to use this space here. Now we're talking about an experiment. In an experiment, my dear, we have variables. एक experiment के अंदर आपके पास variables होते हैं, right? Experiment के अंदर when I say आपके पास variables होते हैं, variable है क्या? Anything that is subject to vary or change, right? Variable is anything that is subject to vary or change. We use the word variable for that. Clear, dear? Right? Now, taking it a step ahead, when we talk about these variables, there are two different type of variables that you all need to know, that you all need to understand. And they are initially there are two type of variables that you all need to know. And let's talk about an independent variable, also referred to as an IV, and a dependent variable, that is DV. Independent variable क्या है? Independent variable वो वेरिएबल है जिसे एक्सपेरिमेंटर खुद चेंज करता है, जिसे एक्सपेरिमेंटर खुद मैनिपुलेट कर रहा होता है, राइट? नाउ a variable that the experimenter himself or herself changes or manipulates deliberately to see how it's affecting the result of an experiment, we use the term independent variable for that. However, on the other hand, when we use the term dependent variable, what exactly is a dependent variable here? Dependent variable is more or less the result of that experiment, right? Now, remember, I was saying I'd give you an example here. Let's just say if I want to figure out the relationship between the amount of light in the classroom and the effect it has on the concentration level of students. The effect it has on the concentration level of students. Right? Now, don't you think if I'm going to figure out the relationship between the amount of lights and the concentration level of students, I the variable that I'd be in a position to manipulate over here in this case would be the amount of light. मुझे अगर ये देखना है कि भाईजान ज्यादा लाइट होने से या कम लाइट होने से स्टूडेंट्स की कंसंट्रेशन लेवल पे किस हद तक अफेक्ट पड़ रहा है, तो वो कौन सा वेरिएबल है जिसे मैं खुद मैनिपुलेट कर सकता हूं एज एन एक्सपेरिमेंटर? It's the amount of lights, right? Let's just say I give myself three options. I'd take a class one day with a single light switched on. I'd take a class with another day with two lights switched on, and I'd take a class on the third day with three lights switched on, right? Because this is the variable that I can change or manipulate. Remember, my kids, when I said independent variable, वो variable है जिसे experimenter खुद manipulate कर रहा होता है, जिसे experimenter खुद change कर रहा होता है. Clear, dear? वो variable जिसे experimenter खुद manipulate या change कर रहा होता है, we referring to that as an independent variable. अब experimenter उस variable को खुद change या manipulate क्यों कर रहा होता है? Experimenter उसे खुद change या manipulate इसलिए कर रहा होता है ताकि वो उसके effects को आगे रिकॉर्ड कर सके. अगर मुझे ये देखना है कि क्लास में ज्यादा लाइट होने से या कम लाइट होने से क्लास के अंदर बच्चों की कंसंट्रेशन लेवल पे क्या इफेक्ट पड़ता है, तो डोंट यू थिंक मैं लाइट्स को मैनिपुलेट करके ये देख सकता हूँ? डू वी अंडरस्टैंड दिस? राइट? और अनदर एग्जांपल, if I want to see the extent to which coffee affects your alertness, you could give an individual half a cup of coffee one day, the next day a full cup of coffee, the third day 1.5 cup of coffee. Do we understand this? What is the variable? What is it that we're changing over here? What we're changing over here is the quantity. Yeah, right? The quantity of coffee, and bringing in changes in the quantity of coffee, the effect I'd want to see would be my dependent variable, जो result होगा, right? Dependent variable क्या होता है? वो variable जो के वो वेरिएबल या वो चेंजेस जो आप रिकॉर्ड कर रहे होते हो इंडिपेंडेंट वेरिएबल के अंदर चेंजेस लाने से. क्लियर, डियर? तो एक्सपेरिमेंट्स, माय डियर, दिस इज वन रीजन व्हाई एक्सपेरिमेंट्स आर आल्सो रेफर्ड टू एज एक्सपेरिमेंट्स को अक्सर कॉज एंड इफेक्ट रिलेशनशिप भी कहा जाता है. कॉज एंड इफेक्ट रिलेशनशिप जहां पे आपका IV वुड बी द कॉज एंड योर DV वुड बी द इफेक्ट. गेट इट, डियर? right? Now, taking you back to this text over here, a laboratory experiment is a setting and a situation that is designed to test a hypothesis, an assumption or proposition about the relationship between two or more variables. Variables are things that can vary, such as your social class can vary, your gender can vary, your ethnicity, or the temperature, sound, and light. In a laboratory experiment, they can be held constant or manipulated, change. Experiments are usually designed to see whether, now, if I get back to this research, this example that I was giving you, now, if I want to see the effect light is having on a concentration, right? मुझे देखना है कि light किस हद तक concentration level को affect कर रही है. So don't you think all the other factors besides light, I mean, light would be one variable that I would be changing, but all the other variables besides light, for instance, the temperature of classroom, for instance, the seats, the chairs that you all are sitting on, even they could affect your concentration, right? We could talk about any other factor, right? There are so many other factors that could affect your concentration. What the experimenter in this case has to do is, besides your light, the experimenter would have to keep all the other factors or all the other variables constant. Because if you're not keeping all the other factors constant, then you wouldn't know कि जो इनके concentration level पे effect आ रहा है, ये वाकई light की वजह से आ रहा है या किसी external factor की वजह से आ रहा है. Clear? So taking it a step ahead now, variables are things that can vary, such as social class, gender and ethnicity, or temperature, sound, and light. In a laboratory experiment, they can be held constant or manipulated. Experiments are usually designed to see whether one variable, the independent variable, has a causal effect on another variable, the dependent variable. This is exactly what I had said over here. Your independent variable, causal effect. Clear, dear? The variables and results of laboratory experiments, the variables and results of laboratory experiments are usually quantified or usually quantifiable, right? Now, once you have a basic idea about what laboratory experiments are like, to remind you all, we refer to a laboratory experiment as a laboratory experiment because your environment is artificial. आपका environment artificial होता है जिसकी वजह से हम laboratory experiment को laboratory experiment कहते हैं. Get it? Everyone? The main aspects of the experimental method can be illustrated by the example of an experiment. Now, I've already given you an example. This is another example that we have over here. Example of an experiment designed to test the hypothesis that noise has an effect on memory. So what we're trying to figure out over here is that noise has an effect on memory, and this is an example. Let me highlight this as well. The hypothesis is stated in a way that it can be tested. The louder the noise, the more it will reduce the ability to remember something. Every variable in the laboratory except the level of noise, that is the independent variable, is held constant. Now, this is what I was saying. Remember when I was saying लाइट के अलावा बाकी जितने भी वेरिएबल्स है, आप उन सारे वेरिएबल्स को कांस्टेंट रखेंगे, तभी आपको पता चलेगा कि लाइट का इफेक्ट हो भी रहा है या नहीं हो रहा, राइट? Now, for example, the temperature and lighting remains the same. The participant is given a list of 20 random numbers, asked to memorize them within 1 minute and then to recall them. The experiment is repeated 5 times with the noise starting from nothing, that is silence, then steadily rising in measured units. If the participant recalls fewer and fewer numbers, then this may provide support for the hypothesis being tested. Clear here? Now, I hope this example makes sense to you. Does it? This is an example we have over here. If the experimenter's results show a correlation between the independent variable, that is the level of noise, and the dependent variable, the amount of recall, this might indicate that one causes another. Now, over here, you need to understand the difference between the terms correlation and causation. Correlation, my dear, let me highlight it for you. Correlation is when there is a relationship being found between two variables, right? Which does not necessarily mean causation. Correlation alag hota hai, causation alag hota hai. Causation comes from the word cause and effect relationship, right? Let me write both of these for you so that you could recall them later if required. Causation. And many students get confused between causation and causal. I meant causal and casual. It's causal. Remember, over here, U comes before S when you're spelling it. Causal. Causal comes from the word cause or a causation. Clear, dear? So, correlation, if two variables are related to each other, हम ये कह सकते हैं that there is a possibility of causation, and that is why we're using the term. Then that is why this says it might indicate. We're not being sure, we're not being 100% certain, but yes, there's a possibility कि अगर दो links के बीच में variable है कि एक variable दूसरे को cause कर रहा हो. Clear, dear? However, the ability to control variables in the closed system of laboratory helps the researchers to judge whether the correlation is causative or coincidental. Uh, this again, causative, they're all the same thing, right? Your ability to be able to control all the other external variables, if I stick to this particular example of the effect noise having on your memory, तो noise के अलावा जितने भी factors हैं आपको उन सबको constant रखना होगा. अगर आप noise के अलावा, and of course your ability as an experimenter to be able to keep that constant is pretty limited. कई ऐसे variables होते हैं जो आप control नहीं कर सकते. They're beyond your capacity to control, right? Do we understand this? Do we proceed? Now, taking it a step ahead, we have this research example. I want everyone to read through this once on your own. You read through this and then we proceed. Talking about this one. Now that we already have an idea about laboratory experiments. Moving on, if you speak about field experiments, like I mentioned earlier, a field experiment is an experiment which is conducted in its normal everyday or day-to-day environment. It could be a classroom, it could be a factory, it could be street corners, anyway, right? Now, if you have a look at this, you have a research example over here. I'd like it if you all read this. If you read this, you'd have a better understanding of what field experiments are like. Now let's move on and talk about the strengths and limitations of experiments. And you could get a question in your CIEs. You do get question in your CIEs in terms of that demands you to write down about the strengths and limitations. When you talk about laboratory experiments, they have been very successful in the natural sciences such as physics and chemistry. However, if you talk about sociology, there's more of inclination towards field experiments sociology के अंदर. ठीक है, क्योंकि अगर सोशियोलॉजी के अंदर आप रिस्ट्रिक्ट करके एनवायरनमेंट, कंट्रोल्ड एनवायरनमेंट के अंदर रिसर्चेस कंडक्ट करते हो, तो the extent to which its findings would be applicable on real life situations or real world would be questionable. अब controlled environment के अंदर experiment conduct कर रहे हो, how likely do you think it would be कि उसकी findings real world के अंदर apply हो पाएंगी? ठीक है. Now moving on towards the strengths and limitations of experiments. To start off with strengths, the first strength could be, if you're talking about a laboratory experiment, it would allow researchers to control environments. Remember, we're talking about an artificial environment over here. If you're talking about an artificial environment, the chances of you being able to control whatever's happening around would be more. Get it? The second one, the likelihood of you being able to gather quantitative data is again more. Numeric data, hypothesis, हमने पिछली पेज पे ये सब डिस्कस किया था. Number 3, laboratory experiments can be replicated, right? Because remember, they're controlled. If they're controlled, you could keep the procedure standardized. If you're keeping the procedure standardized, आप उसको replicate कर सकते हो, या आप उसे exactly same तरीके से repeat कर सकते हो. और जितनी ज्यादा रेप्लिकेशन के चांसेस होंगे, उतने ही ज्यादा आपके पास रिलायबिलिटी इंक्रीज होने के चांसेस होंगे. रेप्लिकेशन इज व्हेन यू आर कंडक्टिंग अ रिसर्च इन एग्जैक्टली द सेम वे अगेन. And reliability is when you're conducting the research in exactly the same way again and you come up with the same conclusion, right? So next, field experiments provide a more realistic settings. Now over here we're talking about field experiments. Remember, this was laboratory experiment, this was laboratory experiment. Over here we're talking about a field experiment. And when we talk about a field experiment can they're providing you with a more realistic setting. This would improve your ecological validity. This would improve your ecological validity. Ecological validity kya hoti hai? It is the extent to which a study is conducted in its normal day-to-day environment. Clear? Field experiments, like I had mentioned a minute earlier, the chances of your findings being applicable to real world situations are more in a field experiment as compared to a lab experiment. And this is one reason why many sociologists favor using field experiments instead of lab experiments. Let's move on towards the limitations of this. Moving on to whether in the laboratory or in more everyday social context, people are often aware that they're participating. Now, when you're aware that a research is being conducted on you, the likelihood of you altering your behavior or you not behaving in your normal manner would be more. It's pretty common sensual, right? If you know your behavior is being studied, you wouldn't really behave in your natural manner. Clear? That they're participating in an experiment. This in itself is likely to affect their behavior. Any unintended impact on the experiment or on participants is referred to as an experimental effect. Do we understand what an experimental effect is? Right? Any sort of unintended impact on your experiment. The participants, knowing that the behavior is being observed, would of course impact their behavior. Number two, people act in terms. Remember, we're discussing all of this under the heading of limitations or the weaknesses or the disadvantages of experiments. People act in terms of how they perceive others. They will tend to respond differently if the experimenter is young or old, male or female. We're talking about experimental biasness or experimenter's biasness, right? The personality of the experiment, is body language, her body language, demeanor, facial expressions, age, gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic status. All of these factors, they do end up affecting the way individuals would react in front of you, right? So black or white or and so on, people also tend to act in terms of how they think others expect them to act. This might explain the results in the experiment involving the actor dressed as a business person and a laborer researching social class and interaction between strangers. He might have been conveying two different expectations, and this may have affected the response to his request for directions. For example, he may have expected more help in the role as a businessman and unintentionally conveyed this to the participants. The unintended effect of the experimenter. Now, this one, the unintended effect of the experimenter on those being studied is known as experimenter's bias. Now, what is experimenter's bias? It could have to do with his, like I said, his personality, demographic characteristics. Here, moving on. The third limitation here, experiments sometimes involve deception and can therefore be seen as unethical. Of course, if you're deceiving someone, or in other words, you're misleading someone into something, you're not providing them enough of information about the nature, the purpose of your experiment, it is unethical. Very simple, as simple as that. If participants are not informed of the true purpose of the experiment, they're not given the information necessary for informed consent, right? Ideally, an experimenter should be taking consent from participants before the research is conducted on them or data is collected from them. If they were, the experimenter might not work. The experiment might not work. अब अक्सर एक्सपेरिमेंटर्स क्या करते हैं, वो इन्फॉर्म कंसेंट नहीं लेते क्योंकि उन्हें पता है कि अगर वो इन्फॉर्म कंसेंट लेंगे तो पार्टिसिपेंट का बिहेवियर चेंज होगा. So they would either not take consent or they would provide just enough of information and at the same time might be deceiving them by keeping them unfamiliar with the true purpose or the nature of the experiment, right? That's again unethical, like I said. Participants might change their behavior if they knew what the experiment was about. For example, if the participant in Harvey and Stalin's experiment, now this is what we're talking about, this one, this one, right? This one, yeah. For example, if the participants in Harvin's talents experiment researching teachers' expectations and social class knew what was being measured, then they would probably have changed their responses. In some circumstances, it is considered acceptable not to provide participants with full information. Like I said, in some circumstances only, not always. See, wrong is wrong, unethical is unethical. Just because you're doing it or just because you think it was necessary doesn't by any mean or any chance make it ethical. If it's unethical, it's unethical, but you still end up doing it, right? So it is considered acceptable not to provide participants with full information. This might be the case if, for instance, there's no alternative method. If you do not really have any other way to go about with it, you might as well opt for this. And participants are debriefed. Now, what does the word debriefing mean over here? Debriefing kya hoti hai? If you have deceived a participant, right? I'm talking about this term, debriefing. If you have deceived a participant towards the end of the experiment or towards the end of the research, it is essential for you as a researcher to, number one, apologize for what you did. Number two, convince them why it was necessary for you to be deceiving them. Number three, you, of course, let them know about the true purpose of the research. Number four, you make sure that the participants leave the experimental premises in the right state of mind, no psychological harm. Number five, I'm not sure about the numbering that I'm doing over here, but still. Number five, if a participant is still adamant on getting his or her data removed, you might as well do that. Of course, if they're not allowing you to publish their data, you remove it. As simple as that. So, and participants are debriefed after the experiment and given the opportunity to withdraw their consent. Moving on towards the last limitation we have over here, and then we bring this to an end. Most sociologists have serious doubts. Most sociologists have serious doubts about the use of laboratory experiment. This I had mentioned earlier as well with human beings. This is partly because people act in terms of the definitions of situations. They're likely to define laboratories as artificial situations and act accordingly. As a result, their behavior as a laboratory may not reflect as a result, the behavior in the laboratory may not reflect the behavior in the real world. Although field experiments may provide more realistic context, it is not possible to control all the important variables. So, like I said, if it is a lab experiment, you'd be able to control your variables better. But then again, uski findings ko aap kis had tak apply kar sakte ho in real world situations is questionable. At the same time, if you're using a field experiment आपको एक realistic idea देती है, लेकिन field experiment के अंदर for you to be able to control external variables is chances are less. Now, these are the key terms. I'd really appreciate if you all go through them. Familiarity with these key terms would help you write your answers better, would help you understand the content better. I'm just numbering them so that it gets easier for you to be able to keep a track. A few of the terms that you see over here, you have just studied about, and the rest you'd study ahead. This is the summary to it. You might as well have a look at this summary as well. So yeah, that's pretty much it for the day. Take good care of yourselves. Stay happy, healthy, safe, and protected. Stay humble, spread positivity, spread smiles, and Allah Hafiz.